Imagine, spring, 334 BC. The Macedonian army has just stepped onto Asian soil. Alexander III carries a treasury that will sustain this force for 30 days. Not 30 months, not 30 weeks, 30 days. The war chest was assembled through borrowed money, cancelled taxes and mortgaged noble estates. There is no reserve line. A single engagement without plunder and the campaign dissolves. Not in defeat on a battlefield, but in unpaid soldiers drifting home. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor assembled at Zelia to form their response. One voice offered the only plan that could have collapsed the invasion before any ground was taken: Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek who had spent years in Persian service and grasped the single exploitable weakness in Alexander's position: 30 days of treasury. His proposal: avoid battle. Strip the land of food and fodder. Pull back. Use the fleet to cut the Macedonian link to Greece. Without supply, the army retreats. The satraps refused him. A foreign mercenary dictating that they burn their own territory was an insult they could not accept. Pride selected the outcome that served Alexander best: a fixed engagement. The Granicus River gave the Persians a natural advantage they were right to use. The eastern bank rose steeply from the water. The current was fast and the riverbed treacherous. Any crossing force would lose cohesion before it could establish itself on solid ground. Persian cavalry, between 10,000 and 20,000, sources vary, lined the elevated bank ready to strike soldiers as they emerge from the water, Persian infantry behind them. And at the rear, 5,000 to 6,000 Greek mercenary hoplites, professionals, the most reliable infantry on the field. The design was to end the crossing, not contest the ground. Alexander reached the river around mid-afternoon with approximately 18,000 men. The rest of the column was still behind. Parmenion offered the sound assessment: rest the men, cross at first light. The Persians might abandon their elevation overnight. Either way, the force would be rested. The advice was militarily sound. Attacking a defended river position at late afternoon, after a full day of movement, into prepared cavalry above, this is the kind of engagement that fills cautionary chapters. Alexander ordered the crossing, not from contempt for caution, from 30 days. Every night without a victory was capital consumed for nothing. The assault opened with a deliberate feint. Amyntas, son of Arrhabaeus, led a vanguard of companion cavalry into the water, not the elite, a forward element, expendable enough to absorb the first contact. Missile fire from the bank hit them immediately. The current broke their formation. Animals lost footing. From the Persian bank, this read exactly as intended. The crossing was failing. The cavalry on the heights moved down into the shallows to press the advantage. The moment their hooves left the high bank, everything they had gained from the terrain left with them. They were in the river. So was Alexander. With the Persian cavalry committed to the shallows and their position broken, Alexander angled the companions upstream rather than charging straight at the concentrated force. Then he wheeled and hit the Persian flank in wedge formation. The fighting was not cavalry warfare in any conventional sense. No room for momentum, no space for shock tactics. Arrian records it as hand-to-hand combat on horseback, each man working his weapon at close range. The advantage went to whoever kept their seat. Alexander was recognizable. White-plumed helmet, the royal bodyguard alongside him. The Persian nobles identified him immediately. Mithridates came first, Darius's son-in-law driving through the press toward the king. Alexander's lance found his face. He went down. Rusaces arrived at the right side. His blade came across the helmet, cutting through the bronze and into the scalp. Deep enough to bleed. Alexander held his seat. Spithridates was behind him, sword already in motion. The target was the back of the neck. Cletus the Black, commanding officer of the royal cavalry, squadroned to reach Spithridates before the blow completed. The sword arm was cut free at the shoulder. The distance between Alexander alive and Alexander dead at the Granicus was one man's speed. As the cavalry fought at the waterline, the Macedonian phalanx entered the river. Sarissas levelled. Even wading through sediment and current, the 18-foot pikes projected beyond what any horseman could close. The The formation compressed crossing the water but held. No horseman presses through a pike hedge at arm's length. As the phalanx secured the far bank, the Persian cavalry was caught. Companion pressure from the flank, the pike wall blocking withdrawal below. The elevated bank that had been their advantage now penned them against collapsing ground. The left gave first. The fracture spread rightward. A rupture that began where Alexander struck extended across the entire line. Memnon extracted his cavalry before the enclosure closed. He left the field. That would matter. Behind the broken Persian line, the Greek mercenaries had held formation throughout. They had never entered the river. Still intact, shields locked, weapons ready, on the high ground. They sent a request for terms. Alexander declined. The campaign rested on a framing of Greek liberation from Persian rule. Greek soldiers in Persian employ, permitted to leave intact, made that framing untenable. And militarily, men this composed, released, would reinforce whoever came next. Refusing was not cruelty. It was prevention. The mercenary engagement cost more than the river crossing had. Professional soldiers who had watched the battle kept composure and chosen their ground. They extracted significant Macedonian casualties before their formation finally collapsed. Arrian's figure of 115 Macedonian dead for the entire battle is treated by most modern historians as a ceremonial number. The real cost was higher. By how much, the surviving record does not say. Roughly 2,000 mercenaries were taken captive. Alexander sent them to Macedon for labour in the mines. The remainder were killed. No negotiated exits. The cities of western Anatolia drew the obvious conclusion. Sicilium was evacuated before Macedonian forces arrived. Sardis, the wealthiest city in Anatolia and financial capital of the western satrapy, submitted and handed over its treasury without resistance. Ephesus followed. Then Miletus. The Ionian coast recalculated. What Alexander had purchased at the Granicus with 30 days of operating funds was now his: revenue, stockpiles, supply lines, and time. The campaign was no longer a gamble on a single afternoon. It was a sustained operation. 3/4 of the Persian force cleared the field. Memnon escaped. Granicus did not break the Achaemenid structure. What the battle produced was not destruction. It was proof. First, Persia can be broken in the field. In 334 BC, this was not certain. The empire had stood 2 centuries and crushed challengers with resources alone. A Macedonian force half the size of the defending army had engaged and routed it. Granicus ended the assumption. Second, Alexander leads at the front and survives. He had taken a sword to the skull and remained in command. In ancient warfare, that is not incidental. It is the core of what makes an army follow a king into a river. Third, the campaign is financially sustainable. The 30 days of treasury that launched the invasion became, within weeks of the Granicus, the revenues of western Anatolia, the gold of Sardis, and a supply chain that needed no borrowed money. Far to the east, Darius III absorbed the reports. No border skirmish, no reckless raider. A Macedonian king had beaten a Persian army in open battle and was receiving the submission of Achaemenid cities. The next confrontation would not be with satraps. It would be at a place called Issus, and Darius would come himself, with everything he had.